Hi, my name is Kylie Christine, and I think that we can all attest to the fact that sometimes life does not go according to our plans. So, my blog is a place that I hope we can all be encouraged in those seasons of life where things kind of seem to go off the rails, encouraged in our faith to continue pursuing the things of God, and encouraged in Christian community to sustain us while we are here in this place that we never planned on being. So, go check it out, KylieChristine.com. So this started a year ago. I had this idea to bring together people who are in a season of life that maybe they never saw coming. And I think it's really interesting how, even as Christians, we always have our own plans, but the Bible's really clear that we have our plans, but it is God who orders our steps. And so even if the plans that we have and the ideas that we have are God given, the path that we're going to take to get there may not look the way that we think it should look. And that's kind of what happened. That's how I got here. So the whole title of the blog is While We're Here. Subtitle, When Life Doesn't Go According to Plan. And I thought maybe I could talk about how I got here, what my here is. I actually got really linked into a specific ministry and a specific campus ministry when I was a college student. So shout out to everybody who does college campus ministry. You are changing people's lives. I wouldn't be doing this without that step. I grew up in the church. I grew up knowing the Lord. I got saved when I was 7 and baptized when I was 8 because I was too scared to walk down the aisle in the First Baptist Church of Warner Robins, Georgia, and make my public profession of faith. So I had to get the courage up for a year after getting saved before I would go and get baptized. But I don't really recall there ever being a time in my life that I wasn't talking to the Lord or hearing from the Lord. I just remember having this like alone time. My parents would say I needed to go have Kylie time. And I knew I was never really alone. So having a faith as a college student, that part wasn't hard, but getting into the right community of believers was something that really changed my walk with the Lord. When I was in college, I got plugged into this ministry. I got plugged into this church when I was a student at Belmont University, Nashville, Tennessee. And all of a sudden, college was over, it was time to graduate, and I was moving to Cincinnati where had been growing up before going to college. And my parents were here, and it was kind of like I was going home, which even that was funny because I told the Lord when I was in Nashville, I'm never going back to Ohio and I am never going to be a teacher. And at the end of college, I moved back to Ohio to be a teacher. But what was really frustrating for me about that, I was excited about it and I wanted to do it. But when I was 19 and plugged into this ministry, I went to this big conference, student conference. And while I was there was a woman on the stage and she was speaking and she was teaching. And I was listening to her and taking in everything that she said. And it wasn't something that she specifically said, but it was just in being in that moment. I knew at the age of 19 that the Lord was going to call me into full-time ministry. But I was 34 when that happened. So there was a really long period of waiting. And teaching was not part of my plan. But again, we have our plans and the Lord orders our steps to get to where he wants us to go. So I graduate, I come back to Ohio, and for 8 years tried to get myself plugged into a church here. I didn't know life without being part of a church. Like just going and sitting in church wasn't enough for me. I needed to serve, whether I was leading worship or in a kids ministry or greeting people or something. I needed to do something in the church because I had always been a part of that. And I started leading worship when I was in high school and in college. So I thought maybe that's what I needed to do here in that period of 8 years after graduating and then coming back to Cincinnati. And I could not get involved with churches long term. It's just like I would get in and I'd be there for a year, maybe 2 years. I would sit down with pastors. I would sit down with pastors' wives and, ask them, what is it that you want me to do? Like, I'll serve. What do you need? And I actually, kind of the last straw for me was I sat down with this woman. And she was the pastor's wife at a pretty prominent church in the area. Great church, nothing wrong with it. But I asked her, what do you need? How can I serve? And her response to me was, I don't really think there's anything we need right now. And I'm sure, looking back on it, I am sure that her process and her thought behind that statement wasn't, we don't need you, but more so, we don't need you to do anything in order to be accepted here. Just come, just be a part of this, right? Without the feeling of like, well, if I'm not doing this, then I don't have a place. Um, so I have a feeling that that's where she was coming from. But how I heard it wasn't that I wasn't wanted, but just that there was not going to be anything for me to do. And at that point, I was like, you know what? I'm done. I'm done. God, I will not force myself on any church in any position. And the churches were all fine, but they weren't what God was calling me to. So I went home after that meeting and I said, I'm not doing this. I'm not church shopping anymore. If you want me to be part of a body, you've got to highlight where I'm going. I keep trying things out and I'm kind of wandering aimlessly, looking for the spiritual family that God had called me to. So about a month after that, I literally wrote that in my prayer journal. I said, Lord, I want a community of like-minded Christians. I want the spiritual family that you've called me to, and I'm not moving and I'm not forcing this on my own. You're going to have to bring that to me. So a month after I wrote that in my journal, then I see this post on Facebook, and it is pastors that I had at my church in Nashville, not just any pastors that I had at my church in Nashville. These are the pastors that spent a good chunk, I would say 3 out of the 4 years I was in school, meeting with me, discipling me, and spending time investing in my life while I was there. And the post that I saw says, we are moving to Cincinnati. We're starting a church with this same global ministry that I had been a part of as a college student, that I've been so plugged into. And when I say I was plugged in with these pastors specifically, like I babysat for them every Friday night. This was like a family away from my actual family when I was in school. And these were the pastors that were coming from this global ministry, like thousands of servants of the Lord that could have come to Cincinnati, Ohio to plant a church. And it was these people. So to me, there's no mistaking God was in this, and immediately messaged like, we forgot you were there. And I'm like, I didn't know that you guys were coming. And it's like this whole big reunion. And they now serve as the associate pastors at the church that I work. Even beyond that, the other part of the team that was coming from another church in Orlando, Florida to plant were people that I had known in college, two of whom I was in the same college with. And my lead pastor was the guy that walked the girls to their car after the evening services in downtown Nashville, making sure that everybody got there safely, got home safely, all of that stuff. And so it's really easy to follow him as a leader now because I knew him when he was serving in the smallest ways. Just an incredible man of honor, a family that is so welcoming and so open. And so I start serving after 8 years of being here with no church, with a church plant. And God made it really clear to me, like, this is why you couldn't get involved anywhere else, because I had a family set apart for you. I had something set apart for you. But in those 8 years, I felt completely isolated and completely alone, and couldn't make anything happen for myself. And that was an incredibly frustrating process. Fast forward a little bit. The church starts and we're up, we're running. I'm still teaching full time and I'm serving in this church with as much time and capacity as I can. And then I start getting frustrated in the education field. And there were some changes at my job that made it really hard for me to connect the way that I had been connecting and to function the way that I had been functioning as an educator. And those that are in public school education know it gets harder and harder every year with more and more laws and more things that are passed, and more and more responsibility placed on teachers. And I was up for the task, but the grace was ending for that season. The Lord was calling me out of that. And then I thought back to that conference when I was 19 years old. And I knew the next thing God had for me would be full-time ministry, but we couldn't make it happen. Couldn't figure out how. There was no specific job available or anything like that. So here comes another period of waiting. But finally, at the age of 34, 4 years after the church plant started, God made a way, and like a midnight miracle kind of moment way for me to leave the field that I was in on good terms as an educator and start something new in full-time ministry. So that's kind of the point that I wanted to talk about. Sometimes it feels like there are things that happen in our life and it's happening completely off schedule, or it's 7 years too late. In my case, that's how I felt, 7 years too late, with this church and with this family. Why was I here for all that time without this? Why not have another church family that I could get plugged into and Christian community that I could be a part of? Why was it such a tough road for 7 years? But there are things that the Lord can teach us when we are in that season of what feels like isolation. There are distractions that we don't have when we are one-on-one with the Lord. And there's characteristics of him that we get to know in what feels like a wilderness season that are going to be the very things that serve us when he takes us out of the wilderness and into the promised land. So even though it felt like 7 years too late, in the eyes of the God who holds all eternity, it's right on time.